Good evening, everyone, and we're so glad you came to hear this wonderful program about strong women's stories. We have 6 fabulous tellers for you tonight and wonderful stories all about how wonderful women are. Our first teller tonight is Linda Yamoto, and due to the technology of Zoom, she is coming to us all the way from California. She, for more than 30 years, she was Ranger Linda to thousands of students and families in the San Francisco Bay Area. She's now retired from her career as a park naturalist, but she continues to tell stories. And she has been a member of she ran the Bay Area Storytelling Festival for 30 years. I can't believe anybody did that long. And she was on the National Storytelling Network board for 6 years. She's a member of the Asian American Storytellers Unity, whose project, Asian American Storytopia, is to promote awareness and appreciation for Asian American culture. Her story tonight is a Japanese folktale about 3 generations of very strong women. Linda Yamoto.
Thank you. Mukashi mukashi, aru tokoro ni. Long, long ago in Japan, in a small mountain village, there was a baby boy born. Now, not just an ordinary baby boy, but an enormous baby boy. And the village people were so happy. They thought that this was a good omen. It was auspicious. It would mean good luck that such a child was born in their village. And so they named him Chichai Yama. Chichai, small, Yama, mountain, baby mountain. And they doted on him. They watched him grow and grow and grow. Now, children in Japan are introduced to sumo wrestling from a very young age, as young as 3. And they have tournaments in their schools for both the boys and the girls. So when Chichayama was 6, he could out-wrestle anyone in his grade. By the time he was 12, anyone in his school. By the time he was 16, he could out-wrestle anyone in the entire village. And so they decided they could no longer call him Chichayama, Baby Mountain. They renamed him Okiyama, Big Mountain, Mighty Mountain. Now in the fall, Okiyama decided he was ready to go to Edo, the capital of Japan, and enter the Emperor's Sumo contest. It's held in the winter, and it determines the strongest man in all of Japan. And so he began walking toward Edo. And with every step that he took, the ground would shake a bit. Birds would fall out of the trees. Little animals would scurry away in fright. But he didn't even notice. He was thinking about the money that he might win from this contest. But he did notice a young woman just ahead of him who was filling her wooden bucket from the stream alongside the path. She climbed out onto the path ahead of him, put the bucket on her head, and began to walk. Well, Okiyama thought it might be kind of funny if he snuck up on her and tickled her, and maybe she would spill some of her water, and then he could offer to refill the bucket and maybe carry it home for her. So he grabbed up behind her. Kocho, 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 kocho. Well, she did giggle, but she didn't spill any of the water. Instead, she took one arm and clamped it down hard on his hand. Oh, you are strong for such a young woman, but I don't want to hurt you. I wouldn't worry about that. Pull harder. And so the harder he pulled, the tighter her grip seemed to get. "Oh, you must let me go. I am Okiyama. I am going to the Emperor's sumo tournament." You don't look all that strong to me. Perhaps you need to come home with me and meet my Bachan. She is a wrestler. She might get you ready for the tournament in time." "I am Okiyama. I do not need your Bachan's help or anyone. Now let me go." But the young woman simply turned and began to walk, dragging Okiyama behind her. His feet were making furrows in the dirt path. Daijobu, Daijobu, okay. I will go with you. Just let me go." So she raised her arm. Okiyama looked at his swollen red hand and wondered what he had gotten himself into. Well, the two of them went up a steep mountain path and came to a small thatched hut. In the doorway of the hut were two little feet. "Shh, that's my Bachan. She is taking her afternoon nap." And then around the corner of the hut came another woman, perhaps this young woman's mother. And this woman was carrying a cow on her shoulder. When she saw the two, she put the cow down quickly and brushed the cow hairs off. "Kuniko-chan, who is this?" So Kuniko introduced her mother to Okiyama. "Hajimemashite. Nice to meet you. But why were you carrying a cow?" "Oh, the rocky paths are so hard on her hoofs, so I carry her down to the field and back each day." Then Kuniko explained to her mother why he was there and could they get him ready for the tournament in just 3 months' time. So the two women walked around Okiyama, looking him up and down. He flexed his muscles. "I don't know. He's kind of puny. Maybe we should ask Bachan." So the two of them yelled, "Bachan!" She was a little hard of hearing. And in the doorway, you could see her two little feet moving. Hey, yes, I'm coming. And out of the hut came a little woman bent over, leaning on a cane. Ow, itai. That is the third time this week I have tripped on those tree roots. And with her skinny little arms, she yanked the tree out of the ground. "Could you take care of this for me, dear? My back is a little tired today." So the mother picked up the tree and threw it like a rocket clear over to the other side of the mountain. And then Okiyama's eyes glazed over and whoomp! He fell to the ground at Bachan's feet. Who is this, dear?" It's the first she had noticed of him. So they explained who he was and why he was there, and did she think they could get him ready for the tournament in just 3 months' time? Oh, Takusan, so much work. But she picked him up, carried him into the hut, and placed him on a futon bed on the floor. The next morning, the three women got busy. Kuniko-chan dragged him out of bed and took him to the stream where he bathed in the ice-cold water. Mother had him pick up bigger and bigger stones to increase his strength. And twice a day, she fed him that very special stew called chankonabe, made especially to make sumo stronger and healthier. And then every evening, he and Bachan would go out to the practice ring in their yard. Now, a sumo ring is about 15 feet in diameter, and it's lined with a special rope that's woven from rice straw. And this straw rope is placed around the perimeter so that you could feel the perimeter of the ring, the boundaries of the ring with your feet. Now, the women thought, well, Bachan is pretty old and frail, so she probably can't hurt him too badly. And now the object of sumo is really pretty simple. You want to push, shove, trip, or throw your opponent out of the ring, or make any part of their body other than the soles of their feet touch the ground. There are 82 different moves to do this. But no matter how hard he tried, Okiyama could not push Bachan out of the ring. Day after day passed, and he did get stronger. And as autumn turned to winter, finally, one evening, he was able to shove one of Bachan's feet out of the ring. Her face brought into a crinkly smile. Josu, very good. Mother clapped him on the back so hard his eyes began to water, and Kuniko hugged him so hard he thought his ribs were going to break. They felt he was ready for the sumo tournament. We want you to take the cow. Your cow? I can't take your cow. How would you plow the fields? Well, the three women nearly fell out laughing. Mother is 15 times stronger than any cow. We just keep the cow because she has such beautiful eyes. Yes, and I am getting a little tired of carrying her down to the fields and back each day. We want you to take the cow, sell her in the next town, and with the money that you get, you buy yourself that 30 feet of silk that you need to make your mawashi, your sumo belt. And then when you wear the belt, you will think of us and it'll bring you good luck. Well, then any money that I win will be yours. Oh no, we can't accept any money from outside our family. So Okiyama turned to the two older women and asked if he might have Kuniko's hand in marriage. The two women put their heads together and made it look like they were having a hard time deciding. And then finally they smiled and said, "Hi, yes, we agree." And Kuniko agreed too. So the next morning they combed his hair into that special top knot that's worn by sumo and samurai. He picked up the cow and he headed down the mountain, waving and waving until he could barely see the three women waving back at him. In the next town, he sold the cow. He bought himself 30 feet of beautiful purple silk for his mawashi. And he made his way to Edo, the capital. Now, when he got to the imperial palace, there were so many rikishi, professional sumo wrestlers, some very famous ones. Nobody paid any attention to Okiyama at all, but he signed himself up for the contest. The next morning, when his name was called, he climbed onto the platform that holds the ring. Each of the opponents carries out certain rituals. First, they grab a handful of coarse sea salt, throw it up into the air into a big arc which purifies the ring. Then they clap very loudly to get the attention of the gods, and then they show their open hands, showing that they have no weapons. And then each of the opponents performs shiko, which means they raise up one of their legs really high and stomp it down on the ground hard. But when Okiyama did this, raising his legs, he stomped it down so hard, it sounded like a clap of thunder, and it caused his opponent to go bouncing out of the ring, and with the official as well. When the opponent refused to return to the ring, Okiyama was declared the winner. Now, the next day, when his name was called for his bout, this time he performed shiko, but not quite so loudly. He wanted to wrestle. And the match begins when each of the opponents facing each other, they put their fists down onto the ring at the same instant. And when that happens, they each leap up and they slam into each other with a force of 2 tons. When Okiyama slammed into his opponent, he went flying up into the second level where the emperor was sitting. So each match of 15 days, he won easily. And at the end, he was declared the winner, given a large silver trophy and all the prize money. Now, when he was introduced to the emperor, he bowed low to accept his prize, and the emperor whispered in his ear, "Please do not come back next year. I don't want you embarrassing the other wrestlers." Well, Okiyama gladly agreed. He decided he didn't want to be a rikishi after all. He wanted to be a farmer. And so he took his trophy and his prize money and he headed home to Kuniko. She saw him coming, so she ran down the mountain. She picked him up, carried him all the way back home. So Okiyama and Kuniko were married, and I'm sure they lived happily ever after. But the villagers down below, every now and then they would hear, and they knew it was just Bachan and Okiyama practicing their sumo. Meditashi, meditashi, that is all.
For our second story, we're going to have a complete change of pace. We're going to hear from Trish Dumser, who grew up in a full family of Irish tellers. I just can't imagine how much fun that was. And she has been telling for 2 decades. She honed her craft at workshops and conferences for the National Storytelling Network and the North Carolina Storytelling Guild. She had the opportunity to take classes at the wonderful story program at East Tennessee State University. She tells various types of stories that she hopes will educate, amuse, and touch the heart. Her story tonight will be from history, her favorite genre. And so here she is with a story from 1777.
I'm glad to be here to tell you a lady from American history who was called Lydia Darrah. And here is her story. It begins in the late fall of 1777, and the place is the colonial area of Pennsylvania. George Washington and his army are walking along, really walking, no longer marching, basically trudging, for they have lost a great many battles and they are very discouraged. The Washington sits high on his horse, trying to influence his men, encourage them. They are very discouraged. They are short of everything, especially victories. And they are particularly upset about not being able to retake from General Howe, the British general, the city of Philadelphia, the very heart of the American colonies. They are walking slowly. They are discouraged. They are short of everything, short of material, short of supplies, short of hope, most of all, as they trudge their way toward a place called White Marsh, which is about 15 miles outside Philadelphia. There, they were going to recoup. They were going to try to pull their forces together, reorganize, resupply, and somehow bring some hope into this downcast group. Meanwhile, in Philadelphia, General Howe had marched in with no problem at all. He led from Britain, of course, the strongest, best army in the entire world, the best trained, the best supplied men that could possibly be garnered. And his walk into Philadelphia was perfect. He moved right down to the middle of the house, the middle of the city, and set up a headquarters at Philadelphia 2nd Street. On 2nd Street, there were 2 houses. One was a giant one that he commandeered for his troops. The second was one that belonged to a family called the Darrows. It was a small house, but it had a wonderful keeping room in front. And that room was to be part of the story. Now, when Howe moved in, he had a lot of soldiers with him, but a special cadre of very high-level officers whom he was going to use to plan super strategies. But he needed a place quiet enough for them and confidential enough for them to meet. And he was told that the lady across the street had a quiet house where he could meet his troops, and they would be able to plan exactly what they needed to do to get rid of this George Washington in short haul. He was furious that he'd been sent by George to this stupid lost colony, and he just wanted to go home for Christmas. He was desperate to get rid of George Washington. And so he sent our aide-de-camp, who was a man named Andre, and Major Andre went across the street, knocked on the door, and was greeted by a very sweet, petite lady. She came and said, "Yes, sir. What would thee like?" And he noticed that she was wearing the garb of the Quakers, the dark dress and the white hat that showed that she was part of the Friends movement, people who were opposed to war in all ways and decided that she was going to be a very nice neighbor indeed. "Well, madam," he said, "General Howe wants you to know that in the service of the king, we need your home for meetings." Now, she may have been sweet, she may have been polite, but this man was asking her, in his own words, to please move away with relatives so that we can have your home. She was sweet until it came to her family being upset. And then this sweet, tiny little lady got very feisty. She answered politely, "No." And she dashed across the street demanding that she have an audience herself with General Howe. As she went across the street, she was lucky to have a cousin who was working there at the headquarters, and he offered to take her up to see General Howe. He'd vouch for her himself and see what they could work out. Well, she went through her tale about not being able to give up her home. Howe went through his situation about needing his place, and she said, "Is there not something, sir, that we can work out?" And so they came up with a plan. Now, what she was to do was every time that the general needed that room for a meeting with his commanding soldiers, he was to have that house. She was to take her family to bed early, retire immediately, stay in bed for the entire night, and no one in that house was to get up. The generals would have their meeting, and Major Andre said, "When we are finished, madam, I will knock on your door. I will get you, and you can come, you can extinguish your lamps and lock your door." And so she had agreed. Now, she left the headquarters, went across the street, and before she got home, she broke into a great smile because she was a sweet little lady. She was a sweet little Quaker, but she was one of the few Quakers that had decided that the cause of the colonies was so just that they could eliminate their loyalty to the idea of neutrality. And she was a spy. She and her husband, William, had set up a little plan at their house. They were around and about all the time downtown because he was a tutor. She was a midwife. And they were out and about and did what they called keeping their ear to the ground. They would catch whatever information they could possibly garner and put it on notes, went out to George Washington. Now, the method of getting the note out was really kind of astounding. William, the husband, had adapted a way of using a chart and made little notes. The notes would be put in tiny little pieces of paper, and the code was known by Washington, as well as the Darrows, of course. The coded note would go inside the button of young John's coat. They had a 15-year-old boy who was willing to go out and deliver the messages to Washington. No one would ever expect a young lad would have anything carrying on him to bring information. And so he would always go right past the sentries, waving as he went, confident that his mother was filling them up sometimes with nice things like biscuits and scones. And they would wave off young Master John, and he would go into the woods and he would be throwing up a ball or playing with a slingshot like any young lad just going to meet his friends in the countryside. Once past the sentries, however, he would look around cautiously, and when he knew that they could no longer see him, he stopped sauntering and he ran like a madman, because he had to go all the way up to the Rising Sun Tavern. And that was a place where George Washington's officers would come for a little bit of libation, perhaps, and kind of gather and rest, and where William would go over, greet everybody pleasantly, and surreptitiously slip out the note from the button, put it in someone's hand or under the table, and he would then deliver that message. The person who got the message almost always brought the information to Washington. So it was a good system. And he would saunter back in, wave to the sentries as he went, and his duty was done. Well, that went along for a long time, but then a few days after that particular trip out to the country, Major Andre came to the door. He said, "Mrs. Dara, Mrs. Dara." "Yes." "You remember the agreement we made?" Oh, absolutely, sir. I listened to thee carefully. "Well, what we need to do tonight is bring our officers over here for a meeting, and you know what you are to do." "Yes. Oh, yes," she said. And she knew they were to be in bed early. They were to stay in bed. They were not to make noise, and they were not to leave their rooms for any reason at all. She agreed. And that night, the soldiers came in the door. She went over, greeted them politely, and reminded them she had made some little biscuits that were by the fire if they were so inclined, and then went into the hallway where she and her husband, William, opened the door of their bedroom, closed it very hard, and went into the room. Now, the officers all gathered a little bit at a time, and when she heard no more movement at all, she knew they were starting their meeting. And she opened the door of her bedroom as quietly as she possibly could. Quietly, and she streaked down the hallway, hoping that one of those floorboards would not give her away. At the end of the hallway was a thing that looked like a closet, but it had no real back on it. It was attached to the wall of the keeping room. And when she stepped into that closet, she could hear everything that was being said in that room. She stayed there listening carefully, getting all the details of what they were talking about. It was a battle. She was talking about columns of soldiers, a number of artillery pieces, and directions and times, and she was remembering everything. And then with a look of horror, she realized what they were planning was to decimate Washington at White Marsh. The idea being that he would be wiped out, the battle would be over for good, and they could go home, possibly for Christmas. Her heart pounded, for in truth, her son William, though a Quaker, was already out in that camp with White Marsh. She knew it was important that she get this down. She heard them scrape the chairs along the floor, and as they did, she knew she had to move very quickly. She ran down along the hall as quietly as she could, opened the door of her bedroom very slowly, very carefully, and then as soon as she did, closed it quickly and jumped into her bed and pulled the quilt right up over her head. She was certain that her heart was pounding so hard that it would be heard outside the door. Oh, if they ever asked her to get up, her palms were sweating. She was breathing hard. It was clear that she was doing something. And so she lay there. And before long, Major Andre knocked at the door. Mrs. Dara, it's time for you to get up. Extinguish your lanterns and lock your door, please. We are finished. She never said a word. She never breathed a breath while he was there. And he knocked again. Mrs. Dara, it is time for you to close up your house for the night. You may get up now. She said nothing, did nothing. And finally, he just went away, joining the other majors as they exited the door and went back to headquarters. Now they moved very quietly and carefully because She had gotten a small candle, and she and William sat on the floor of their bedroom. And as she remembered all those details, pouring them out, the artillery, the lines, the times, everything went down on paper for William. And he coded it. And before long, they had a detailed message on this supposed surprise attack on Washington. This was too big a deal to entrust to a little boy in his button jacket. This was something she was going to do herself. And the very next morning, she put her plan in action. She went out and she carried the bag that was supposed to carry her flour for the house. She put it over her arm and she headed out toward town. As she got to the sentries, they said, "Be careful, it's getting cold now." She said, "No, I'm just going to go over to the miller's and pick up some flour. I'll take my time and enjoy the outdoors." "Oh, thank you, my dear." They liked her very much. She was a favorite. And off she went. She walked, sauntering along until she got to the end of the woods. And when she did, she knew it was time to run. Now, I can't quite imagine this little lady running because, according to records, she was about 5 feet tall and about 3 feet wide. Must have been quite a chore for her to run the way she had to, but that she did. She ran directly to the miller's, dropped off the bag, and very graciously said, "I'll be visiting a few friends out here in the country for a little bit, and then I'll be back." And she sauntered off until she was out of sight of the miller. And again, she ran or waddled or whatever it was that she did so quickly, and off she went to the tavern. As she walked in, she spotted a major that she knew. And just by eye contact, they made their connection. And she walked over to the table where he was, slid the message out from her little reticula and onto the table. He picked it up with his left hand, squeezed it, and waved goodbye to her with his right hand as she sauntered out the door, and then again took off like a woman running for her life. She ran and ran back to the miller's. She had to get her bag to let them know that she had gotten her flour indeed. And so she got the flour, and now she had cut down a little bit on her running because she had a giant bag of flour to carry as well. So she ran as fast as she possibly could, given her limitations, until she got to the edge of the woods, when she smiled sweetly at the sentries and sauntered back into town. When she got back to see William, she said, "William, thou must know I did all that I could. I don't know what else we could do. We simply have to put this in the hands of the Creator now." And they did. And they waited the rest of that day and into the night, and nothing was happening. And then just before the crack of dawn, the soldiers were heard gathering their gear, marching in quick step, confidently, watching the outside of Philadelphia admire them. People got up even in the night to watch them march. They were so terrific. They marched with high shoulders and brass shiny buttons and clean red coats. And off they went in the direction of White Marsh. Well, William and Lydia could do nothing but wait. And so that's what they did. They waited and prayed, she said later. And nothing happened. The soldiers didn't come back that night. It was an entire whole day and into the next night before they came. But when they came, the Dares were silently laughing to themselves, for they were no longer the haughty, confident, best trained army. They were desolate, disconsolate, awfully sad soldiers. They no longer marched smartly. They dragged their bodies back in, and their fresh uniforms were no longer there. Clearly, they'd been in some kind of a battle. She said nothing at all. But the next morning, there was a knock on her door, and she opened it to find Major Andre. "Oh, Major Andre, how are you, my dear? Come in and have some tea," she said. "Oh, no, ma'am, I do not have time. I have a mission here. I know it sounds ridiculous, and I certainly didn't want to come and bother you, but I have to explain. Something went wrong with our battle plan, and the word got out, and we have to find how and why that word was out. So I have to contact everybody that may have had anything to do with any of our soldiers. Oh, she said, how can I help you? Well, Mrs. Dare, I have a direct question to ask you. When I knocked on your door last night and when our soldiers were here, was anyone else in your house up? Anyone else? She said, oh, no, we did as thou told us. Everyone was in bed. All of my family were sleeping. He said, you're sure that no one else in your family was up? No, she said. Well, I know, Mrs. Dara, that you were not up because I knocked on your door not once but twice, trying to get you to close up your home. And we left here with your lantern still on and your door unlocked. And I knew that you must have been just too tired to hear me. Well, I'm sorry to have bothered you, my dear. Thank you. And off he went. There were no repercussions, but years later, she said to her daughter when telling her about what had happened, you know, I thought it was the grace of God that he asked me the question the way he did, because he said, was anyone else in your home up? And I could honestly say to him, no one else was. I can't say if he had said to me directly, were you up? I don't know if I could have stood before my creator and looked at that young man's face and lied to him directly. Something inspired his question. And that was how Lydia Dara made her name as a strong woman of the American Revolution. Thank you.
Oh, that was wonderful, Trish. Thank you so much. All right. Now, our third teller tonight is Denise McCormick. She hails from Philadelphia, so she was right around that area where they were fighting, but not back then. Now, she has been telling professionally for more than a decade, and she is deeply committed to sharing the benefits of storytelling with a broad spectrum of applications. Among her many roles in storytelling, Denise McCormick is liaison to the National Storytelling Network, past editor of NSL, president of the Patchwork Storytelling Guild, and creative director and editor of the Lehigh Valley Storytelling Guild Family Storytelling Series. She's an active member of various and other local and national organizations where storytelling plays a role. Tonight, she's going to tell us an ancient story of Philomendra. Denise McCormick.
Once upon a time, there lived a quick-footed woman. Every day she rushed to get to work because she dawdled to leave her children, and every day she rushed to get home. By the time she reached the doorway, a great choking lump of joy burst from her throat in a song that the children knew as a sort of game. 1, my darling, come to mama. 2, my darling, come to mama. 3, my darling, come to mama. Ah, such joy. But one day the woman was seized with a pain unlike any other, as if her heart ripped in two. She felt its threads pulled apart, so that she put one hand to her breast and raised the other and pursed, "Stay, Philomandra. Stay where you are. Stay, Philomandra. Stay." Imagine. Philomandra obeyed, waning like a speck of dust eclipsed in shadow. Imagine pain to the child, pain to the mother, pain to the siblings. Not one was spared, and it happened again and again, day after day, and such a lingering evil thing doesn't stay tucked in the corners. No, indeed not. It rose up like hot breath, higher and higher. And the stench of it was carried on the wind until it reached the nostrils of the devil. And the devil relished it and devoured it and developed a craving for it. And he determined to have more, much more. He followed the scent to its roots, and he watched and he waited. He saw the quick-footed woman. He saw the children squinched tight within themselves. For days and days, he saw hope emerge and break to a discordant halt. It was delicious, and he wanted more, and he knew how to get it. He'd steal the children away. The devil is cunning. He studied Mama's song, and when he thought he'd mastered it, he put his plan to steal the children into motion. The mother left the little house, but before she returned, the devil sang out, "One, my darling, two, my darling." Now the children were not fooled. They did not go. But the devil wasn't deterred. The devil is diligent and patient. He continued to hone the song. Again, the mother left the little house, and before she returned, the devil sang out, "One, my darling, come to mama, two, my darling." But again, the children were not fooled. They did not go. Still, the devil was not discouraged or dissuaded. He is persistent. For a third time, the mother left, and before she returned, the devil sang out, "One, my darling, come to mama. Two, my darling, come to mama. Three, my darling, come to mama." Stay, Philemandra. Stay where you are. Stay. The children, 1, 2, and 3, left. Philemandra stayed. When the mother came home, she sang out. But 1 did not come. 2 did not come. 3 did not come. Philemandra came. With eyes cast to the floor, she choked out, "1 cannot come to mama. 2 cannot come to mama. 3 cannot come to mama." Mama stood frozen. Her eyes grew wide, and she folded to the floor, shaking violently. A howling wretch, a crazed woman, she left the house searching for her stolen babies. She did not return. Philemandra was alone, but she was not a baby. She was old enough to fend for herself for a little while, but then what? She left too, in search of something. Down the path she went, down the narrow dirt road. Through the forest she went. She saw the sunshine pour through the canopy of leaves and dapple the forest floor with light and shadow. Heard a brook nearby babble a pretty tune, and butterflies flitted here and there among the wild flowers. Somewhere a blue jay called out to its mate, and an owl hooted a reminder that some folks were trying to sleep. A breeze caressed Philemandra's face, and the whole world lightened a little bit. And she heard in the distance a cacophony of strange sounds and smelled strange smells too. She heard voices and instruments and animals and the jostling of many things. As she moved toward the marketplace, one and another of the people she encountered smiled at her or said hello, and she responded in kind. She ran up to one or another to offer a helping hand. Some folks gave her food. others explained their crafts. She found kindness, and she returned to the marketplace day after day after day. And she became learned about people and business and beauty and quality. Time passed. Philemandra became a woman of quality and beauty. It won't surprise you to know that one day a prince, he came many times, and he observed Philemandra's way with the people. Nor was he oblivious to her beauty and grace. He fell in love with her, and she with him. And one day, the prince asked Philemandra to marry him, despite where she came from. Philemandra was a good match, for all the people knew and loved her. And Philemandra said yes. And she went to the palace where a great feast was held, a wondrous wedding. And Philemandra lived happily with her prince and with the king and the queen. But again, time passed, and eventually the king and the queen passed on. And so the prince became the king, and Philemandra became the queen. And together they had their own little family. Now it happened that one day a servant woman came to speak with Philemandra. "Pardon me, your highness," she said. "Excuse me for interrupting you in your work. But I thought I must tell you today in the marketplace, as I was going from one stall to another, I passed a woman who was so offensive to me that I began to walk away from her. But even as I did so, she was mumbling under her breath. And when I listened, Queen Philemandra, I heard that she was singing your song, that song that you have always sung to your children, and I thought that I should let you know." Hearing this, the blood ran from Philemandra's face, and she grabbed hold of something to still herself. And then she called out for the guards to come, the soldiers, and she instructed them to go with the servant woman at once back to the marketplace and to scour the streets until they found that old woman and to bring her back to that palace, to bring her back before the queen. And so 2 soldiers, together with the servant woman, went to the marketplace, and they looked high and low, up and down the streets, in the stalls. And just when they were ready to give up, they went down one of the small alleyways where the refuse was. And there they found the old woman on the ground, talking to herself and ripping at her hair. And the soldiers seized her and grabbed her by the arms, this spindly old woman with droppings in her hair and clothes that could hardly be called clothes, just rags. And they lifted her and they carried her back to the palace and took her into the great hall where Princess Philemandra was seated. And they set the old woman down on the floor. And Philemandra raised herself up from her chair, and she walked a long path to the old woman. And then she looked down, and she stopped. She paused for a moment, and she reached out and she touched the old woman's face. And she said, "Mama, Mama, don't you know me, Mama?" Mama, don't you know me? It's me, Philemandra. Oh, Mama, when I was just a girl, you didn't know how to love me, but Mama, I know how to love you. And from that moment on, she gave her mother nothing but the best and cared for her all the days of her life. And more than that, gave her grandchildren to love and to be loved by. And in that way, Philemandra truly did live happily ever after.
Wonderful job. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. All right. Well, our next story teller is Lona Bartlett, who comes to us from North Carolina. And she is a professional storyteller, puppeteer, and educator. And she has delighted audiences of all kinds for nearly 30 years. Lona Bartlett tells stories anywhere they'll let her on stage, and oops, sometimes when they won't let her on stage. Their story tonight is Fairy Cakes. So you'll have to keep a close eye out for the fairies that are hiding in the branches of the trees, because they want to bring home the best baker in the town. Lona Bartlett.
Thanks, Judith. Rebecca was by far the best baker in town. Well, everybody talked about her. Her biscuits, oh, they were light as a cloud. Her cookies were absolutely perfect. But her real specialty happened to be cakes. That was the absolute favorite of everybody. Have you tried her lemon cake? It can be the coldest day of the year and it makes me feel like sunshine. Oh, her coconut cake? I just have to have it for every celebration. It's absolutely delicious. Oh, no, her carrot cake with a cream cheese frosting. Oh, I could eat that every day of my life. Well, little did the townspeople know, but there were fairies that were sitting about in the branches of the trees, and they were listening as all the townspeople talked about Rebecca's cakes. Because you know, of course, that one of the favorite foods of the fairies happens to be cake. And as they listened and heard, the littlest fairy goes, I like cake. Cake is good. So all the fairies got together. They waited for Rebecca to go into her kitchen, and they all went down the chimney and into Rebecca's kitchen, and they went around Rebecca. They picked her up, pulled her up through the chimney, and took her back to fairyland. They went over hill, dell, and valley, and they set her down in the giant oak tree. Well, that tree had one time been owned by the Keebler elves, but their manufacturing facility needed to be much bigger because, of course, their disbursement had gotten so large. So they moved out of there and went to a warehouse, and they left that hollow tree vacant. Well, it was a perfect place for the fairies, and they took Rebecca in and sat her there, and Rebecca looked around, and it's a very nice kitchen. But why have you brought me here?" And the littlest fairy looked up at Rebecca and said, "I like cake. Cake is good." "Oh, so you'd like a cake?" And all the fairies shook their heads up and down. Rebecca looked around in that kitchen and, oh my, we seem to have a problem here. I have to have a really big bowl to make a cake for all of you, and you just don't seem to have one here. Now, I have one in my kitchen at my house. So if you'll go back and get that bowl, bring it back here to me, then I can start making the cake. And the littlest fairy looked up and said, "Cake for bowl?" So all the fairies got together and they went back over valley, dell, and hill. They just went back to Rebecca's house. And when they got there, they searched around and they found Rebecca's really big bowl. And they took it back to that hollow tree and gave it to Rebecca. Oh, this is perfect. Thank you so much for getting this. And now, oh my, what about my spoon? I can't make a cake without my very large spoon. And all the fairies looked at each other, and the littlest fairy said, "Cake for spoon?" And so all the fairies got together and they went back over to Rebecca's house. They looked around, they found her big spoon, and they brought it back to her. "Oh, thank you so much. Yes, this is exactly what I need. Now for the Oh, the flour. You haven't enough flour." But I've got 2 very large bags back at my house. If you'll go back there and get those 2 very large bags of flour, then I'll have enough flour I can bake you a cake. And the littlest fairy looked up and said, "Flour for cake?" So all the fairies got together and they went back to Rebecca's house. Well, they searched around, they found those 2 big bags of flour, and they took it back to Rebecca. Well, wouldn't you know, it turned out the same way with the baking soda and the sugar and the salt and the butter and the everything else that Rebecca needed for the cake. And those little fairies went back and forth and back and forth, and they were just absolutely getting tired. Well, finally, Rebecca started to mix up that cake, and she looked at her watch and said, "Look at the time. Now, my baby is back at the house, and there is no way that I'm going to be able to finish this cake until I have my baby here because I have got to feed her." The littlest fairy looked up and said, "Baby for cake?" And they all did like babies. So they all got together, they went back, got Rebecca's baby, and brought her back to her. Rebecca fed her baby, and she poured the cakes into the cake tins, and they were ready to go in the oven. But then she realized, oh my goodness, my husband is going to be coming home, and he's going to want his tea. And, I just can't go any further until I give my husband his tea. And the littlest fairy said, "Husband for tea?" So all the fairies got together and they went back and they got Rebecca's husband and brought him back to the tree. Well, she gave him his tea. They spoke for a few moments, and then Rebecca put those cakes in the oven. And they waited and they waited, and the aroma that filled that hollow tree was absolutely delicious. And then all those little fairies were so excited because that cake was going to be coming out of the oven. And Rebecca took the the cake out and she put it on the counter. And the littlest fairy said, "Time for cake?" "Oh, no, 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 the cake has to cool and then I have to ice it." "You do want icing on your cake?" And the littlest fairy said, "Icing is good." And so they waited and waited for the cake to cool. And finally it was time. Rebecca mixed up the icing and she spread it all over that cake and on the sides. And she put the top on and she spread it all over. And while she did that, those little fairies began to yawn and stretch, and they put their little heads down and Rebecca said, "The cake is done. You can have it now." And the littlest fairy said, "Too tired for cake." And so Rebecca looked around and saw and listened as all those little fairies just slept away. She picked up her baby and she took the hand of her husband. She got her mixing bowl and her spoon, and they all walked out of that hollow tree and back over the valley, dell, and hill, back to her home. And every day, at the end of the day, when Rebecca was done baking all the cakes for the townspeople, she made sure she made one extra, and she would put it out the back door on her porch, and then she would listen. She could hear the little fairies out there just eating away at that cake, and then when she looked out, she saw little fairy footprints all over her back porch. And if you listened very, very carefully, you could hear the flutter of little fairy wings. And the littlest fairy, "I like cake. Cake is good."
I love that story. It's good. I agree. Our next teller is Delana Reed, storyteller, teacher, mentor, and scholar, a professor of storytelling at East Tennessee State University since 1999. She loves guiding storytellers in character development and delivery skills. She enjoys telling personal stories, folk tales, ghost stories from Appalachia and around the world. Her favorite stories touch upon the sacred, explore relationships, and expand our understanding of humanity. The story Li Qi, the Serpent Slayer, is a Chinese folktale dating from the 4th century BCE. In this story, one young girl shows how courage, wit, and foresight surpass brute strength.
Thanks. Way high up in the mountains, against Yungling Mountain, there once lived a gigantic serpent. Now, this serpent might never have troubled anyone if it weren't for the fact that he finally killed off all the animals on the mountain, either killed them off by eating them or scared them away. This serpent was so big that he was said to be 80 feet long. He could fill an entire street in the small village below at the foot of the mountain. He was 10 feet around with green scales and large yellow eyes and teeth like swords. Well, this awesome creature began to creep down the mountain further and further to find food, and ended up in the village below. There, he began to kill off the livestock, the oxen, the sheep, the pigs. And finally, one poor stray villager met his end. Well, by this point, the magistrate of the village was undone. He couldn't imagine what he was going to do about this horrid creature. And so his advisor said, send to the king for soldiers. So he did. He sent word to the king, and they sent 10 soldiers back. These warriors made their way up that path all the way up to the cave at the top of the mountain where the creature lived. But the next day, only one soldier made it back. Barely made it alive. He said, that creature is unbeatable. We couldn't defeat him. Well, when you're in a dilemma like this, and you know that your villagers are clamoring for help and for safety, who better to call upon but a sorcerer? We're dealing with magic. Let's fight magic with magic. And a sorcerer who had heard about this creature, this serpent, came to the village and presented himself to the magistrate. Your Eminence, I would like you to know that if you provide me what I need, I believe I can solve your problem. Well, what do you need? I would like a fine house, perhaps the finest in the village, filled with delicacies of food and wine and servants to wait upon me. There I will go in and I will meditate for 3 days and come out with your answer. Well, this is worth it to the magistrate. So indeed, he gave him his own house, where it was the largest and the best in the village. And in went the sorcerer, closing the door. 3 days passed. Nobody heard or saw movement from the house, till finally all the villagers had gathered round. The magistrate was on the porch, and the doors opened, and out stepped the sorcerer. I have had a grueling 3 days. In my dreams, this horrid creature, this serpent, has appeared to me. It was as if he was in the same room with me. The odor from his mouth was just putrid, and that made the magistrate's nose twitch. Finally, I bargained with this creature to save all of you. This is what he said. If you will send him one 14-year-old girl on the 8th day of the 8th month each year, he will leave the rest of the village alone. But if you won't, he will destroy all of you. Everybody was clamoring and muttering and saying, we can't do this. We can't send our daughters there to die. But what choice did they have? And so the magistrate agreed. And in so doing, he made the sorcerer the one who would handle the lottery, because they would do it as fairly as possible and have a lottery to draw which daughter would go up once she was 14 years old. Now, year after year passed, and each year another girl went to her death. And each year, the serpent more or less kept his promise. So occasionally he might come down and steal some livestock. Occasionally the unwary villager might lose his life, but all in all, it was much better. 9 years passed. In the 10th year, by this point, the sorcerer was having trouble finding girls to send. Now, you must understand that he had grown quite wealthy with all of this, because what happened is the wealthy people in town would bribe him nicely so that their own daughters would not have to go. Then the sorcerer took a small portion of the bribe and he went to the peasants, to the poor, and gave them that payment for their daughter. They looked sometimes between an option of sending their daughter now to her death, or maybe seeing her die of starvation the next year. So they agreed. But it seemed now by this time that the fewer and fewer people were sending their daughters, more and more were hiding them and not making them available. So the sorcerer was wondering where he would get a daughter. At the same time this year, there was a young woman named Li Chi. Li Chi had just turned 14 years old. She was the oldest of 6 girls. She was tired of this. She was angry. She hated seeing her neighbors and friends and cousins go to their death. So she came up with a plan and went to her parents and said, "Honorable ones, please, I am of no value to you. You have 6 girls, no sons. You don't have the money for dowries for all of us. Allow me to go, my parents, and be the sacrifice." "No, Li Chi, no. We cannot let that. You are not worthless to us." Well, she could not get them to relent, and she didn't think she was going to be able to anyway. So later she snuck off and went to see the sorcerer herself. There, she proposed that she be the one to go. The sorcerer was delighted. Why, he didn't have to find anybody. She was volunteering. "But," Li Chi said, "I want several things to take with me. One, I'm going to go on my own 2 feet. I want to have a sword, a sharp sword. I want a hunting dog, a dog that hunts serpents, and certain foods in a bundle." "Girl, do you think you can kill this serpent? We've had soldiers and they couldn't do it." "Those are my terms." "No problem. I'll be glad to give you that." So the day came, the 8th day of the 8th month. Li Chi went to sorcerer's house, and there he had the dog, the hunting dog, the sword, the things that she had asked for. And he accompanied her up the mountain to make sure that she went. But he began to huff and puff so much because, well, over the years, he'd grown quite corpulent and out of shape from all the easy, rich living he'd been having, that he said, "I must not go further. You go on by yourself. You can find him easily." With a rather jaunty wave, he went back down the mountain. Li Chi went on, and certainly it wasn't hard to find because a path had been cut into the earth by the body of that huge serpent. And it was killed things along the way. It seemed to have some kind of ooze coming out of it. So she had no problem. And when she got to the mouth of the cave, even before she saw that yawning black opening, she could smell its horrid breath. It almost made her faint. You see, the creature was sleeping, taking an afternoon nap, and as it breathed out, its breath just rushed out of the cave and into her face. Well, she got her wits about her and quickly began to gather some kindling and some firewood. She found a flat stone. She put it near the entrance and built the fire around the stone. On the stone, she put some flour that she had in her bag, a sweet flour, and some honey, and began to stir it up, and it began to aroma began to fill the air. Then she took some rice balls wrapped in lotus leaves and she placed them on it and warmed them up and stirred the whole mixture. That aroma began to go into the cave, and when it did, the serpent awoke. It began to slither out and she could hear it coming closer and closer, and she froze along with her dog. When its big head, big as a barrel, came out and its body pushed out to get that food, she and the dog quickly ran over to the side and watched as it dove down for the food. And when it dove down, its face was burned, its mouth was burned, and it began to screech, a horrible screech, as it reared back up into the air. It was at that time that the dog came and leapt and bit off and scratched off one of its eyes. It again whipped its head around in great agony, and then Li Chi came forward with her sword. The dog came again and bit the other eye off. Now the creature was completely blind. Li Chi reached up under as it twisted its head around and waited for it to come down looking for her, its mouth wide open. And when it did, she thrust upward with the sword through the roof of its mouth and into its brain, killing it instantly. It fell to the ground, shaking the earth, and she, covered with blood, fell to the ground in exhaustion. After she rested, she got up and she had one more thing to do. She went into the cave, and there she found the bones of her fellow villagers, the other girls, and gathered them up to take back down for burial. Now, when she did, she looked at their bones and she said, "Oh, if only you had been willing to ignore what people said and fought for your lives, fought for justice." By now it was almost dark, and she made her way back down the mountain with her dog, now a fast friend. When she got down to the village, and even when she showed them the bones, nobody believed her. They couldn't even believe she was alive, much less that she killed the serpent. But finally, 3 brave men went with her back up the mountain to find out for themselves. And when they came back down and said, "Indeed, the serpent is dead and we are safe," everyone celebrated. They made a big banquet and all people were there except for 2. One was a sorcerer who saw that his time in this village was probably over, so he slipped away. The other was a magistrate, for the magistrate was dishonored by his behavior and his decisions, and he too slunk away. They say that a wonderful ballad was written to celebrate Li Chi, the serpent slayer. They also say that the word got to the king and he granted her father the magistrate position and blessed them with riches. And some say she even married him. That's the legend of Li Chi, the serpent slayer.
Terrific. We have one more story tonight. Janelle Bem is an award-winning storyteller who currently calls the Gulf Coast of Florida home. She lives with her husband, Dennis, and her dog, David, and can often be found creating community around a campfire by sharing her passion for the ukulele and her gift for storytelling. Her story, The Mother-Daughter Sandwich, draws on her personal experience. She will have you laughing, but you won't read the story until it touches your heart. Janelle Bem.
Thank you, Judith. Thank you. And thanks to all the other tellers tonight. What a wonderful and inspiring evening of stories of strong women in this the kickoff to Women's History Month. You get two chances in life at a mother-daughter relationship. The first is as a daughter to your mother. And the second is as a mother to your daughter. I read that once in a self-help magazine years ago, and I don't know why, but for whatever reason, it made me think of a sandwich. I shared the article with my mom, and she thought of a sandwich too. She saw herself as a pleasantly plump bun on one side, and me as a happy little hot dog in the center, and my one day, someday future daughter would round out our mother-daughter sandwich. Mom and I shared a lot. She told me that from the time she was a little girl, she dreamed of a daughter of her own. Here I was. We share the same eyes and the same nose. And I don't know if there's a gene for this, but there is a goofy, playful prankster place in my heart that I know comes directly from that woman. Her favorite game was to make eye contact with the people in other cars at a stoplight and then flick her false teeth at them. I have all my own teeth, so I lack the equipment necessary to play this game. But I have been known to take a magic marker to the grocery store and draw startled expressions on all the bananas. Mom and I shared so much, but one thing we never shared, not even for a second, was her dream of a daughter of my own. I saw our mother-daughter sandwich as more of an open-faced affair, and I was fine with that, which is why it came as such a surprise when my heart gave itself to a man with not one, not two, but 3 children from his first marriage. Greg, Patrick, and Kelly, 2 boys and a girl. Now I know what you might be thinking. Great, Janelle, mother-daughter sandwich complete. And you don't even have to have stretch marks. But it wasn't that easy. Kelly already had a mom, a good mom who loved her very much. And there was no way I was going to push myself into that mother-daughter sandwich. And I just wasn't sure if there was room in her 8-year-old heart to be part of my sandwich. So what do you do with that? Well, I'll tell you what I did. I took a page from my mother's recipe book. Mom always said, if you want to cook up a relationship with someone, you love them as they are. You see, when I was a little girl, about the same age as Kelly when I met her, Mom could see that I had about 0 maternal instinct. So she thought she would fan the fire of feminine energy in me by buying me a complete set of Barbie dolls. There was Barbie and Ken and Skipper and PJ and all their little friends. And these people, they were only 10 inches tall, but let me tell you, they had clothes. They had clothes, and I had 0 desire to play with them. So what did my mom do? Did she shame me for not being feminine in the same way she was? Did she lay a guilt trip on me because she'd spent all this money on these dolls and I didn't want to play with them? Nope. My mom enlisted the aid of my brother and my dad, and she had them build a barn to Barbie's scale. And then Mom went out to garage sales and she bought plastic horses. And just like that, Barbie and all her friends became ranch hands. I was so much more interested in teaching Barbie how to ride a plastic horse than I ever was in picking out her next outfit for a date with Ken. Mom's recipe: you want to cook up a relationship with someone, you love them as they are. So that's what I did with Kelly. We started by going to Disney princess movies together. And then when she became fascinated with glitter nail polish, I had her give me a manicure. But when that kid dyed the neighbor's cat orange for Halloween, my prankster heart leapt with recognition of potential. And I taught her the fine art of squirt gun warfare, including the ambush of the unsuspecting adult. The kid was a natural. You want to cook up a relationship with someone? Love them as they are. And that's the recipe I was following years later when I cooked up the idea of a multi-generational shopping trip. By then, Kelly was 16 years old and her second home was the mall. And my mom had a lifelong relationship with shopping. And I had a good job with lots of disposable income. So it seemed like we had all the ingredients for the perfect mother-daughter sandwich. We decided to start our day by having lunch together at the TGI Friday restaurant across the street from the mall. And when we had finished, we reckoned that it'd be easier to use the restrooms at the restaurant than trudge all the way through the mall to the public bathrooms there. So we made our way through the tables, single file, Mom, me, Kelly, laughing, talking, singing. I opened the door to the ladies' room. There were 3 stalls. Perfect. Mom went to the far stall. I went to the middle. Kelly went in the first. And when I got inside the stall, I saw that it had one of those giant rolls of toilet paper, and my prankster heart was inspired. I quick pulled off 2 gigantic wads of toilet paper. I climbed up onto the toilet seat, and reaching over the tops of the stalls, I looked and yelled, "Air raid!" and dropped the wads of toilet paper down, only to realize it was not my mom in the far stall. Yes, I had dropped a wad of toilet paper on the head of a complete stranger. I ducked down in the stall, listened, and waited for that woman to leave. And when I thought it was safe, I opened the door to my stall. There stood Mom and Kelly. That's the kind of thing that'll get you arrested. Mom, I thought it was you. I put my hand on the door, but it was locked, so I had to wait. Target identification and acquisition are among the first rules of squirt gun warfare. Kelly was right. I had made a rookie mistake. Mom, did you see her when she left? Was she mad? She was a bit confused, but I flicked my teeth at her and she ran away. I'm just wondering what this woman's story is to her people when she gets back to her table. Good point, Kelly. And we left the restaurant and quickly made our way to the mall. The rest of that afternoon, we would occasionally erupt into spontaneous fits of laughter when one of us would recall this whole incident and imagine it from that poor woman's point of view. And when we spotted that woman at the end of the aisle in the Macy's store, they almost had to call for a cleanup on aisle 3. You get 2 chances in life at a mother-daughter relationship. The first is as a daughter to your mother. Mom and I shared so much more than eyes or a nose. We shared a deep and abiding friendship. The second chance is as a mother to your daughter. Kelly and I don't share any biology. I can't look at her face and see my eyes or see my nose. But when my heart looks at her heart, it recognizes itself. And in that recognition is a knowing. And in that knowing is a bond every bit as thick as blood. The daughter of my mother and the mother of the daughter of my heart. And that is a mother-daughter sandwich that feeds the soul. Yum.
Wonderful. What great stories we had tonight. Everyone was just excellent. And I thank all of you for coming and attending and listening. It's very important to have listeners. If nobody listens, did we really tell a story? You know, you can't tell. And I thank all the tellers tonight. They put in a lot of hard work to get here. And I appreciate all their patience with me. And I thank you all. Good night.